Welcome to the City Current Show, powered by Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services.
This show focuses on sharing good news and powering the good in our community. Now here's your host, City Current CEO, Jeremy Park.
Welcome back to the City Current Show, powered by Higginbotham. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're always honored to bring you inspiring stories of individuals and organizations making a difference and powering the good. And we always love helping our nonprofits and nonprofit leaders become more successful with their efforts. That's why we're honored to have with us our good friend, Katie Spencer, founder of Zipline Consulting. Katie, how are you doing?
Doing great, Jeremy. How are you doing?
We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and dive in. We've known you and worked with you for a long time. You've been a presenter with our Get On Board series in the past. You're going to present again this year, so we're super excited to have you. Let's start with your background, your backstory, and what led you to launch Zipline Consulting.
Yeah, so I worked in the nonprofit sector for 15 years. I'm also a cultural anthropologist with my academic background. So I love supporting, helping nonprofits, but I also just have an eye for how do organizations work. Where do they get stuck, and identifying that. So I love working with organizations on sort of what are the things that have them stuck and how can we move forward through those. So as I said, I worked in the nonprofit sector for 15 years, both in local organizations and then at Boys and Girls Clubs of America on the national scale. And then just over a decade ago, I had 2 young kids. It was time to stop traveling for my own work for a short bit. And although I'm back to traveling now, but I started consulting. And so I've been doing that for a little over a decade, and it's fabulous. I love it.
Let's dive in and start with some of the big shifts that you're seeing with nonprofits, because nonprofits, especially during the pandemic, were forced to innovate. You've seen some great innovations and structural changes and ways that they're leveraging social media, but also there's things that obviously still need to be innovated. So talk about what you're seeing generally within the landscape of nonprofits.
Yeah. So, COVID, it was amazing how organizations innovated. I had really been concerned prior to COVID that the nonprofit sector wasn't innovating, wasn't keeping itself relevant, and yet the work was so important. And I really had fears that if the nonprofit sector didn't kind of stay a little bit closer in step to how the world was shifting around us, that they would sort of start to struggle more. Well, during COVID, I was floored by the multitude of ways organizations innovated, showed up, really made things happen. It was phenomenal. And I was so energized and inspired by that. And what I'm seeing now is, first of all, those organizations showed up and totally exhausted themselves. So while burnout is actually a national trend, not just in the nonprofit sector, it is really an epidemic in the nonprofit sector. And also what's happened is we showed up and innovated in our ways of service, but not always in our operations to keep up with our other innovations. And then factors outside of the nonprofits themselves have really been changing at a rapid pace and not very consistently either. So fundraising landscape is shifting continuously and in very unpredictable ways, which is making revenue hard, right? The talent climate has really tightened. So outside of nonprofits' control, but because nonprofits haven't invested for so long and we're behind in both talent development, but certainly in salary, they have really struggled more than other organizations to keep up in the talent atmosphere. So we're struggling with talent retention, talent changes, turnover. And, just uncertainty in general. There's been global uncertainty, political shifts globally, nationally, statewide that keep affecting nonprofits and are also just making it feel uncertain. So folks are having a hard time feeling like they can plan for those things, like they can stick a stake in the ground and move forward and make some commitments, take some risks. So I feel like right now, and I don't just feel this way, data is showing that nonprofits are struggling. There's a multitude of factors that are really hindering their growth, their progress. And unfortunately, there are a lot of nonprofits that aren't making it through. So we've had more nonprofits, we've had an increase in the number of them, but we're also seeing a lot of them that are struggling to the point of shutting their doors. So I'm concerned about this trend, and I think we have to do some things to change it.
So, where do you like to start the conversation when you're sitting down and getting an assessment for the nonprofits? And you mentioned obviously fundraising, burnout, employee retention, leadership. There's a lot of things to look at, but what are the things that you like to look at? What are the questions you like to ask to get a pulse of where things stand?
Such a good question. So there are trends across organizations for sure. So any nonprofit who's struggling, please know you are not the only organization struggling. That's the first thing. I think leaders feel very isolated and concerned, but don't really have the bigger picture of what's happening in other organizations around them. I see behind the curtains at a lot of organizations. And, the first thing I really do is find out what's most challenging for you. What are you really struggling with? What are your pain points? And then I like to go deeper because most organizations are going to tell me a couple of the same things as their pain points. And fundraising is always number one. Programmatic delivery or impact, depending on what they do. But, and then it might be also board engagement is another big one. But the truth is that there are layers beneath that really tell the story as to what's causing the struggle with whether it's fundraising, board engagement, et cetera. And again, there are lots of trends among organizations with those same causes too. So that's where I start the conversation though. What's feeling most challenging right now?
Talk about the three levers that nonprofit executive directors have. And I know that when you talk about, like you mentioned, their boards and opportunities, talk about the three levers.
Yeah. So most of the things that I mentioned when we were talking about, challenges initially in the landscape are things that are outside of a given nonprofit's control, right? They can't control the funding landscape, the talent climate, but they can control three main things. And in my opinion, the nonprofit sector is not going to get easier, right? And the world is certainly not going to slow down anytime soon. But what we can control are our strategic clarity. And I think this is essential. So after a decade of looking at nonprofits, it's hard to believe this. I know if you work in a nonprofit, it feels like teamwork or fundraising, et cetera, are the big challenges. But strategic clarity is the biggest root cause. When I said I like to look underneath, being really clear on what your vision and strategic objectives are is huge. And a lot of nonprofits really struggle with getting very focused and very clear and making sure that clarity is across the board for that their board, their team, their donors, everyone's aligned on it. And then staying focused, right? It's really easy to have great ideas and get distracted or think, well, we could serve this additional group of people if we only just. I believe we need to get much more focused strategically, get much clearer, make some hard choices, and be very specific about what our vision is, what we're trying to create in the world, and how we're making that happen. And I think that positively influences our impact and our ability to fundraise. If you hear role clarity is a problem at your organization, role clarity is likely not your problem. Your team is wondering we're not clear on our strategic focus. And so it's hard for me to know what my role is if I'm not sure what we're really striving to accomplish and how we're planning to get there. So strategic clarity is the first one. And I went back through a couple of years ago, a decade of interviews, surveys that I've done with scores and scores of organizations. And that is the biggest root cause challenge that I have seen. The second one, and we have control of that, right? Like we can control our strategic focus. And so when we feel like we're being blown around in the wind by the world, that is something we can control. We can control really increasing our board engagement. And I know it's a big challenge. It's a huge challenge across nonprofits. And yet, that is something that we can make happen. And we can do that in a number of ways. But if we don't get engaged boards, we will continue to see the erosion of our organizations. Why? Because our staff can only do so much. The board structure exists for a reason. The board has a very pivotal role to play at an organization, and we need our boards to play it. So we need both the board volunteers to show up and be committed and do their work. And we need the staff to support them in becoming much more self-managing. I think the board staff relationship has really become one where frequently, not always, but frequently the boards rely on the staff to really manage them. And I think we can't do that anymore. Our organizations are struggling. Our leaders, our paid staff leaders are working a huge percentage of their time to manage their boards without a huge return back. But we can change that structure. And I won't dive into it today, but I have ways to do that. So board engagement is possible. We've got to work on that. And the other one is more sustainable leadership within our organization. So our staff leadership, we have been burning out our staff for a long time. The old leadership model where somebody joined your organization and was the executive director for a decade, 15, 20 years, that doesn't exist anymore. In fact, recent data that I read a few weeks ago before conducting a workshop said that we are now down to the median, not the average, but the median duration of an executive director's tenure is 3 to 4 years. So the boomers have retired, right? We no longer can expect executive directors to stay for a decade plus. We need to operate on a model where we can expect our leaders to turn over more frequently. So what does that demand of us? That demands that stronger board for consistent leadership and governance and decision-making. It also demands that we share leadership and distribute it across our organizations so that when the executive director leaves or when the CFO leaves, the cards don't fall, that there's a team of leaders who collaborate to run the organization, and they can manage the organization for the duration of time it takes to fill whatever role was vacated. But those are 3 things that I think we have not, again, generally speaking, kept our eye on as closely as we have our programmatic delivery and our fundraising and other things. But we can control those things. And I think that they're actually the pivotal pieces to making our organizations vibrant, sustainable, and able to withstand the shifts in the world around us.
Good stuff. And I think we'll definitely have to have you come back and do a deeper dive, just like you're talking about, on not only each one of the 3 areas, but all the trends and the expertise and the guidance that you're putting out there. You have a new podcast, which also does that and shares thoughts and resources and information as well. So talk about Next Era Nonprofit and what the focus is for the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I did just release Next Era Nonprofit a few weeks ago. It's something I've been wanting to do, partly because I'm an idea person. And like I said, I have an academic background in anthropology, and I just... my brain has ideas and I want to share them and put them out in the world. So I needed a forum for that. And I'm hoping that they're helpful to someone. But I really do see this trend of nonprofits needing, quite honestly, to move forward and create a new era of what is the nonprofit sector. And I think, broadly speaking, the sector needs to make some significant shifts to really be sustainable. And it's because the work nonprofits do is not going away. It's so vital and essential, and there isn't anyone else to do it. So I think we need to rally and really create a next era of what is nonprofit work? How do we create those vibrant, sustainable organizations? So the podcast of available wherever you listen to podcasts, is about that. So some weeks are just me with my ideas that are flooding my brain, and other weeks are interviews with other experts.
What makes you excited when you look at 2025 and beyond? And as you mentioned, the nonprofit sector is critical to the success of our communities, of our nation. When you look at the innovations and everything that we're talking about, the challenges, but really the opportunities, what makes you excited about the future for nonprofits?
You know what makes me excited? Well, a lot of things. I mean, I've seen nonprofits show up and innovate, right, in crises, and not just during COVID, but we see that anytime there's a crisis, nonprofits run towards it, not away. But I really am just excited. I think we can harness all of that passion that people bring to the nonprofit space. I think we can harness some brilliant disruptions that younger generations are bringing to the space, and compile that with a more sustainable model that will help us, serve more for a longer period of time and without the struggle. I've seen organizations do it. I really believe it's possible to run a vibrant nonprofit without all the struggle. And I think that we've got all the ingredients to make that happen. And I'm excited to see how nonprofits continue to do that.
Once again, good stuff. We're talking with Katie Spencer, founder of Zipline Consulting. Wrap up with website, social media. Where do we go to learn more, to connect in with you, and obviously the podcast? Where do we go?
Yeah, so I'm at ziplineconsulting.com. But I also, if you just want to keep in touch with me on a more regular basis, I am on LinkedIn at Katie Kimple Spencer, and I'm on Instagram daily. I'm working hard at being on there daily with, again, all my thoughts, whatever, anything I'm seeing out there in the world, I will share with you on Instagram at Katie_Spencer_consultant. So yeah, I'm out there on the socials, Jeremy. You should be very proud of me.
We're always very proud of you. And as we mentioned too, you're a big part of our Get On Board series. So you'll be leading one of the sessions this year for Get On Board. But Katie, thank you for all you do to power the good. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Jeremy, so much. It's always fun to spend time with you.
Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services is proud to power the City Current Show. We're a people-first company that protects what matters most, the families, businesses, and trailblazers that keep our community going. As one of the nation's top independent insurance firms, Higginbotham is a single-source solution for business insurance, employee benefits, HR services, and personal insurance that's customized for you. We're here to serve you, the people you care about, and your community. Call 866-377-1959 or visit higginbotham.com.